President Trump did a good and solid job on his visit to Texas yesterday, but what really has been awe-inspiring is looking at the first responders, the Coast Guard, the ordinary people who are getting in boats to rescue those in the Houston area who are trapped in their homes, trapped on their roofs. This is not just government, although government seems to be doing a reasonably good job giving the epic proportions, the just huge scale of this disaster. But lots of ordinary folks as well pitching in, volunteering, and in some cases performing the actual rescues. There have been thousands of people rescued. Of course, big problem now is where to shelter them as the convention center is full. All of that, this is going as the one levee has been breached. A couple of reservoirs have overflowed. Harvey is still visiting rain on the Houston area. It just seems like this is going to get worse before it gets any better. But I also want to say a word about the journalists who are covering this story. And I'm talking here about people who've actually on the ground or on the water, as the case may be. This is a time when I think the coverage, when you get away from the political handicapping and speculation, has been pretty good, as tends to happen in time of disaster. I remember this on 9/11. I remember this during Katrina, where journalists, work crazy hours, put themselves into very difficult conditions, both to try to cover the human story that's unfolding in the Houston area and also to convey information, important information to people who might be in need of rescuing or need to know where to get food or shelter and that sort of thing. This particularly was true in the case of television station KHOU, which itself was flooded, and yet it managed to stay on the air, even as they've tweeted pictures of flooding in the offices there, and individual journalists, including a correspondent for the New York Times, whose homes were flooded. So they were dealing both with the personal toll of the flooding and the rainwater and the after effects of the hurricane in Texas, while also trying to do their jobs. At the same time, there have been other journalists who've raised serious questions that we should look at in the future about the nature of these floods, because it's obviously become apparent in the wake of Katrina and Sandy and now Harvey that some of these areas keep having what are being described as once in 100-year floods, once in 500-year floods. And part of the reason is the damage from the hurricane. I learned this when I went to New Orleans area after Katrina, is not so much the storm itself, but the flooding and the aftermath. And that is in part because, according to a very smart piece in Politico, the federal flood insurance program essentially encourages people to keep building in flood-prone areas, because if you can't get the insurance, you can't build. And Houston is one of the top cities where this has been the case, where you have all these low-lying areas that are going to be vulnerable when there is a flood, and Houston has a history of flooding. But there was one person's house which had flooded 16 times in 18 years. That person kept rebuilding and making money off of it, and more than half of the homes that are called sort of repeat flood offenders, or where this repeatedly keeps happening, are in the Houston area. And so I think a serious look has to be given to, does it make sense for the government, in effect, to subsidize the building of houses and shopping centers and all of that in areas that are inevitably going to be flooded and cause more damage and start the whole cycle over again? And those are difficult questions, both technologically and politically, because obviously people whose homes are in those regions want to rebuild. They don't want to move. But does it make sense for the government to keep enabling that rebuilding if, in fact, we're just going to have the same problem with another hurricane and another flood in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? So journalists take a lot of abuse, and I write constantly and talk constantly about the flaws and the sensationalism and the bias in the business. But at a time like this, you see the value of journalists, and you see the bravery of some journalists who are trying to cover this human disaster, even while, in many cases, dealing with their own personal disasters.